Hi, class, and welcome to our discussion from Chapter 1, the Introduction to Interpersonal Communication. As we are embarking in our journey to learn more about interpersonal communication, I do want to start with the key concepts about communications as well as why we communicate and to talk about what is actually interpersonal communication. Hopefully, by going through these key concepts, you will have much better understanding why learning about interpersonal communication is key and how it will help you to improve your own ability as a communicator and how you can be a much better communicator when it comes to talking about your ideas and communicating effectively with people who are in your life. All right, let's start with the first one. So, what is communication? Communication is the process through which people create messages using a variety of modalities and sensory channels to convey meaning within and across contexts. So this definition highlights the five features of communication. That communication is a process. Yeah, that those engaged in communication create messages to convey meanings, and that to convey meanings, communicators choose from many different modalities or form for exchanging messages, such as texting, emails, and face-to-face interactions, and that people transmit information to various sensory channels. So we're not only using our auditory or listening skills, but also we're using visual as well as tactile, touching. So communication basically involves all five senses. Communicators also convey meanings within and across contexts, such as the way we communicate when we're at work would be different from the way we communicate when we're at home. And the way we communicate to our close friends would be different from the way we communicate to our boss or to our colleague or to our parents, for instance. So we understand that context is everything when it comes to communication. Now that we have defined what communication is, let's talk about why we communicate. So sometimes we forget that we communicate because we want to fulfill our physical needs. So there is this broader study of over 3,500 adults that revealed that as little as 10 minutes of talking a day, face to face or by phone, will improve memory and boost intellectual function. We don't normally, make this connection between our needs to communicate with how that actually fulfill our physical needs. But the truth is, people with strong relationships have significantly lower risk of coronary disease or heart disease, hypertension, and obesity than do people with less social integration. So, one thing that I think the pandemic teaches us is that even when we think that we are a loner or we're an introvert, the truth is we still seek that communication with others, be it through phone or be it through face to face, because like it or not, we are a social being. And as a social being, we do need, our body craves that communication that we have with others. And then the next reason why we communicate is because we would like to meet practical needs. So it's the communication is the tool that let us communicate our needs and desire from, talking to our doctors to let them know about our needs, as well as talking to our hairdresser to talk about, which color would you like for your hair, or how would you like to have your hair cut. So definitely we communicate to meet our practical needs. We also communicate to meet our identity needs. So communication is basically the primary way we learn who we are. Each of us enters the world with little or no sense of identity. We gain an idea of who we are from the way others define us or from the way we define ourselves. So, for instance, we wouldn't know that we are quiet unless we have somebody else that we can compare to. So, if you have a sibling or siblings in your family, and you notice that some of your siblings are more outgoing or more extrovert than you, and then you hear, either your parents or your uncles or your aunts were saying that, oh, this child is way more quiet than the other child or than the other children, then you kind of understand that you are being compared and you are perceived as the quiet one, for instance. And that's how we kind of form our identity, that we say that we are, more quiet and we are less outgoing, for instance. Or on the other hand, we can say that we are the one who's more talkative, we are the one who's more outgoing, for instance. So another one that we also fulfill through our communication is the social needs. Communication is the principal way relationships are created. So unfortunately here, despite knowing that communication is crucial to social satisfaction, evidence suggests that many people aren't successful at managing their interpersonal relationships. And most of the time, the reason is because we may not be able to communicate effectively with the people who are important in our life. So we understand, for instance, that we would have conflicts with people, like with our parents, with our friends, with our siblings. And most of the time during that period, it's because we were not able to effectively express our expectation, our desire, our hope, or we may lack in um, our own listening skills, or we may need to improve on our empathy, for instance, so that we can understand other people's perceptions or perspectives better. So definitely we understand that even though communication is important in so many different aspects of our life, and it's part of us as human beings, unfortunately, when it comes to interpersonal communication, there are full of challenges. So I hope you kind of understand why it is important to learn more how to become a much better communicator. So if you take a look at your textbook on page 6 to 7, you will see there are different types of communication process. And in each communication process, especially if we're talking about two people, we see that there is one person who's trying to form an idea or a message, and he or she will send that message to the other person. And the other person will try to understand the message and respond to the message accordingly by sending another message. So there is this loop of communication that's happening at the same time. So therefore, there is that idea of sending a message and receiving a message, or trying to encode or produce a message and decodes, or trying to understand the message, right? And that the communication happens using certain channels. If you're facing the partner face to face, then the channel for the sound to carry to the other person is through the air. If you're talking through Zoom, for instance, then that channel would become the Zoom channel, the camera that is involved, the audio that is involved, so that the communication can happen. And we also understand that whenever we communicate, there's always noise. Noise are the distractions that may impede the communication process. Noise can be from outside. For instance, as we're talking, there is a construction noise outside that may make it harder for you to hear what I'm saying. Or maybe my neighbor would play a loud, volume on their TV, and it makes it harder for me to, for instance, record this video. Or the noise can happen inside as well. For instance, as I'm talking, I may be distracted, I may be thinking about something else, or I may be a bit sleepy right now, so I am not concentrating really well. So those are the noises that can happen as we are having our communication process, and that may impede the communication that we have with the other person. So now that we have talked about the communication process, let's talk about what is interpersonal communication. So we understand that interpersonal communication is a dynamic form of communication between two or more people in which the messages exchanged significantly influence their thoughts, emotions, behaviors, and relationships. So this definition has four important implications: that interpersonal communication is dynamic rather than static. You see that there is always that uh, effort to try to create as clear of a message as possible, and the other person will try to make sure and check in whether they understand it properly, or whether they agree or disagree with what you're saying. It is transactional. There is this transaction between these two people. And it is primarily dyadic. So dyad means two, and it means that dyadic communication means it involves communication that involves two people. And most importantly, it creates impact because this is such an intimate conversation. It changes participants' thoughts, emotions, and behaviors. Now, as we're talking about how it is important for us to strive to be a better communicator, the question would be, what does it take to communicate better? Most scholars agree that communication competence is the ability to achieve goals in effective, appropriate, and ethical manner. So when we're talking about the word effective, appropriate, and ethical, I think we need to break it down so that we understand completely what do we mean by that. So when we're talking about appropriate communication, we're talking about the degree to which our communication matches with the situational, relational, and cultural expectation regarding how people should communicate. So we understand what is appropriate in our culture may be different from what is appropriate in another culture. And so our sense and our sensitivity in understanding what is appropriate makes us become a better communicator. And then we judge how appropriate our communication is through self-monitoring, which is the process of observing our own communication and the norms of the situation in order to make appropriate communication choices. So I would ask you, for instance, have you ever wanted to say something, but your mind stop it because you want to make sure that the way you say it will be the most appropriate one. You want to consider the context, you want to consider the person who you're talking to, and you want to choose your words carefully so that you will be able to make to convey your ideas as appropriate and as effective as possible. Now, speaking of effective, the second principle of communication competence is about effectiveness. So the second characteristics is the ability to use communication to accomplish three types of interpersonal goals. Self-presentation is how you want to present yourself. Like, for instance, when you are speaking, do you want to be perceived as someone who is intelligent, someone who knows the subject, for instance? So how do you want to perceive as you're communicating is what we meant by self-presentation. Instrumental means that you're speaking because you want to achieve a specific goal, and you're trying to be as effective as possible when you're wanting to achieve that goal. Think about, for instance, you want to borrow your friend's car because your car is being repaired, and so you want to talk in a way that makes your friend believe or think that you're capable and you're responsible, and that it's safe for your friend to actually let you borrow the car for a couple of hours, for instance. And then it's also for relationship goals, right? When you want to maintain a relationship or build a relationship, you want to make sure that the way you convey your ideas are as effective as possible. And basically, that's what effective communication means. The last one is this idea of ethical communication, which is the set, when we're talking about ethics, we're talking about the set of moral principles that guide our behavior towards others. So when we're talking about ethical communication, we're also talking about how we want to be perceived as honest and as credible when we're talking about something to someone. So we want to make sure that we are trustworthy, and that people can trust what we're saying and know that we're being honest with the way we communicate. Okay, so now that we have talked about principles of communication competence, let's move on to characteristics of competent communication. So, a person who is competent in communication, they must have empathy, or what we call it as perspective taking. So, empathy is an essential skill partly because others may not express their thoughts and feelings clearly. And of course, it's not enough just to imagine another's perspective. It is vital to communicate that understanding through verbal and nonverbal response. Um, you can imagine yourself in this kind of situations. For instance, you are sad or you're having a hard day, and then you want to talk to someone, and you're hoping that someone will have a listening ear who's willing to understand your perspective and why you're having such a hard day. So this kind of listener, this kind of person who's able to show that they are empathizing with what you're going through will make you think that that person is trustworthy and that person cares for you. That's why it is very important for you to be able to have this kind of empathy and to be genuine in showing that you actually care with what the other person is talking. The other one that is also very important is this idea of cognitive complexity, which is the ability to construct a variety of different frameworks for viewing an issue. So, researchers have found that a large number of constructs for interpreting the behavior of others lead to greater conversational sensitivity, increasing the chances of acting in ways that will produce satisfying results. So, what I'm trying to say about cognitive complexity is the ability in your mind to imagine different perspective and different scenarios. So, sometimes when we are stuck in one scenario, it's going to be harder for us to understand the other person's perspective. Again, with your friend who is, for instance, complaining about their day, which is very hard according to them, and then in your mind you were thinking that, I don't think that that day sounds as hard as it seems, right? I I think it's just okay. It's not that bad, and it means that not only are you in need to actually try to understand the matter from her perspective, but also to imagine different scenarios. So, what was it that made your friend so upset at the time? Was it actually a series of unfortunate events that lead to that incident that may seem very trivial to you, but it becomes, the one thing that made her or him break down, for instance. So this idea of understanding different scenarios, different possibilities, means that you have this cognitive complexity. And then the last one was that idea of self monitoring. Psychologists use the term to describe the process of paying close attention to one's own behavior and using this observation to shape it. Self monitors are able to consider their behavior from a detached viewpoint, allowing the observation such as, oh no, I'm making a fool out of myself. Or, oh my God, this approach is not working well. I'll keep it up, or by saying, I apologize, that's not what I meant. What I meant was this. Yeah. So the ability to actually self censored and self monitoring, as well as trying a different approach, is one of the characteristics of competent communication. And now we're coming into the last part of this chapter, which is issues in interpersonal communication. So, culture, gender, and sexual orientation, as well as technology, can impact our interpersonal communication. It can create issues, but it can also enhance the quality of our communication. When we're thinking about the term culture, sometimes we just think about culture means like going to see. Um, paintings in the museum, or going to see or watch opera, or we're watching ballet or something like that. The truth is, culture is not just a product or an art, or in that concept maybe certain specific type of arts, but culture in this book we're talking about um, the cultural values. Yeah, we're thinking about the cultural beliefs, the attitudes that shape who we are, and that shape the way we talk, the way we eat, the way we sleep, and the way we brush our teeth. So we learn that our cultural beliefs, attitudes, and values that we learn from our parents, teachers, religious leaders, peers, and the mass media is actually shaping the way we communicate. So we will talk more about how culture shapes our interpersonal communication in chapter 5 of the textbook. We will also cover gender and sexual orientation. So here, when we're talking about gender, we're referring to the social, psychological, and cultural traits generally associated with one sex or the other. Unlike biological sex, which we're assigned at birth, gender is largely learned and influenced by our culture. So in chapter 6, we will discuss how stereotypes in gender affect our interpersonal communication. And lastly, we're also going to talk about online communication. Radical changes in communication technology have had a profound effect on our ability to communicate interpersonally. In the textbook, technologies are treated as tools for connecting people, and in each chapter, you'll find frequent mention of technology. Um, One thing that I also would like to address is this idea of ethnicity and race, which is very tied into this idea of culture, will also affect the way we communicate as, um, as a person in a family, as well as a person within close relationships. And we will talk about it more throughout the semester. Now, now that we have come to the end of the presentation, I do want to ask a couple of questions. So the first one is, after discussing about the characteristics of competent communication, do you consider yourself as a competent communicator? Yes, no, maybe. I do want you to explain your answer. And also choose one of the three characteristics of competent communication that you want to improve and provide a brief explanation why. For instance, you may want to improve on the empathy side, and you want to explain why you want to improve on that one. Or you may want to improve on this idea of self-monitoring, and you may want to explain why you choose that one. I also have another set of questions based on the podcast that I assign you to listen to, which is the NPR podcast. And so, what I want you to do is to check the discussion board and make sure that you submit and post your answers, and then make sure that you also respond to your classmates' answer. All right, that is all for the first presentation, and I'm going to look forward to reading all of your comments, all of your posts, as well as your introductory posts. Thank you, everyone.